preparation for the 1957 Constitutional Conference on what to insist upon to secure the North position in an independent Nigeria. The upshot of the conference was that instead of equilibrium between the North and the South, the Northern region was allocated the same number of representatives as the two Southern regions combined, with the consequence that the North could never be outvoted, even if the two Souths joined forces. But in the event of any division between them, the North could ally with one or the other. This 50-50 divide had been sold to the Southerners as a compromise from the 56-44 split that it was said the North would have been entitled to. Insist upon as seats being allocated on the basis of the population count between the regions. This, of course, depended upon the validity of the population claim. The claim was dubious, not only because the British, who had taken sides in the contest, were the ones making the claim, but also because there had been no proper population count in the sense of census prior to the Macpherson Constitution being laid before the UK Parliament in June 1951. Such an exercise made little sense under the colonial regime since outside of Lagos and Calabar, the people had no votes. The regime had always relied upon population estimates only. The only census conducted by the colonial regime started in 1952, by which time the constitutional arrangement which the figures were supposed to legitimize had already been promulgated. Coming, as it did, after the assertion that the North was more populous than the South, the exercise was tainted from the outset. Bias aside, the questionable reliability of the count is evident from the following account given by Mr. John Hilary Smith, CBE, Deputy Secretary to Prime Minister Balewa, until just before the first coup of January 1966. According to John Hilary Smith, I work on the census full-time as an ADO in Kano province, the only expert involved full-time. Enumeration began on 7th July, and in the far north coincided with the first rains. As everyone hastened to plant, the fear was that there might be no counting at all. Lazy enumerators, often schoolboys in a generally illiterate society, and not all keen bush trekkers, might opt to ignore isolated homesteads, and in deference to Islamic practice, there was no actual head count. The head of each household had to list all those within it. It was easy to forge a child or two. It was all fake population from northern Nigeria. Fake. But they sold it anyway, and they started planning the new country based on that fraudulent censor. The British planned it. Britain planned it. The Nigeria you have today is the Britain creation, British creation, the way they wanted it to be. So we can continue killing ourselves just to maintain the Britain's or British creation. Remember that. Despite overreach, the 1951 Constitution still represented a significant milestone. Sorry, give me a sec. I need to give our listeners on TikTok, you know something? Let me take a break. I actually need that break. I will read on after that paragraph. So the fact that Nigeria is Britain creation is no longer lost on us. except for those who probably still feels like they are defending one Nigeria based on what they believe their ancestors, or I don't know, those who have been lying to all of us, that we have something to defend. And the reason why you have nothing to defend and your defense of Nigeria is pure waste of time and pure waste of life is the fact that you were never involved in its creation. And the purpose was, the, what do you call it, the planting of tribalism, ethnicism, religious fanaticism, intolerance, and all of that. Britain planted all of that in Nigeria. It is clear now. It is clear now that if you are an Igbo man and you don't like me as a Yoruba man, I think it is practically not your fault. As a Yoruba man who doesn't like an Hausa man, apart from all these atrocities of the Fulani terrorists too, so I'm not giving them a pass. A Yoruba man that doesn't like a Fulani man, I think it is obvious why now, even though we're not supposed to have Fulani in Nigeria at all. You know that there was never supposed to be a Fulani in Nigeria. The British helped the Fulani to continue their jihad by maintaining the status quo of their subjugation and the takeover of the Hausa land, killing of all their chiefs, all of their kings, imposing emir. In fact, it was the British that created the position of Sultan as well, historically. Uthman Danfodio did not even make himself a Sultan. He only made himself Amir. Amir is like the teacher. Do you understand? Amir is like an emir. It was the British that created Sultan. And that's why you're now having the Emirates, the Sultanate of Sokoto. All these were their creation. And you look at us today. We are fighting for one Nigeria. I am a proud Nigerian. Fuck off. But let's continue. Despite overreach, the 1951 Constitution still represented a significant milestone for the nationalists. Even though it would still be the colonial power in the person of the lieutenant governors that was making the laws. Now the laws were going to be made with the advice and consent of the Regional House of Assembly, of which the educated natives would at last now be members. The promised land of an independent democratic Nigeria was now firmly in sight. They resolved that the new 5-year parliamentary term, which this constitution ushered in 1951, would be the last under British rule. This was the state of play in Nigeria when Churchill returned to power as Prime Minister of Britain in October 1951. The key members of his cabinet ensured that there would be consistency in the British position in the countdown to independence for Nigeria. His foreign secretary was Anthony Eden, who would take over as Prime Minister in April 1955. His defense minister was Harold Macmillan, who would become Prime Minister in succession to Eden in January 1957. These three leaders were supported during their tenures by three forceful characters who held the office of Colonial Secretary in succession. Oliver Littleton, October 1951 to July 1954. Alan Lennox Boyd, July 1954 to October 1959. And Ian MacLeod, October 1959 to October 1961. In these men, the nationalists faced formidable opposition to their agenda for Nigeria. The challenge was compounded by the fact that while the British team were united in their objective of securing the best arrangements to secure British national interest post-independence. On the Nigerian side, there was no common ground, not even on the headline issue of ending British rule. The seeds of disunity which Bodilon and his team had sown amongst them were very quickly manifested in the first trial run of the new constitution, with the election to the new regional assemblies in November 1953, or 51 rather. With only one Northern House of Assembly to which all Northerners could aspire for election, regardless of whether they were Northeast, Northwest, or North Central, election in the North passed with little rancor. The Northern People's Congress, NPC, held the Northern House of Assembly unopposed. The idea of leaders in the North campaigning before the masses for their vote was, of course, alien to the North. To the Caliphate tradition. And so special provisions had been made in the Constitution for indirect election, with the emirs effectively acting as an electoral college. No independent candidates made it to the Northern House of Assembly. Even Aminu Kano, the NEPU, the NEPU leader, failed to make it through. In contrast, the arrangements for the South, where there were now two regional houses of assembly, saw unbridled competition. Not only were there many more political parties, many more candidates campaigned and were elected as independents. By the end of the exercise, the Pandora box of ethnic politics had been well and truly opened between the Yoruba and the Igbos in the Western House of Assembly, and between the Igbos and the smaller ethnic groups of the Eastern region in the Eastern House of Assembly. To shield the North from an invasion from the South political influences, the British framers of the Constitution had taken care to ensure that elections to the National House of Representatives would be indirect, with members of the House of Representatives being elected from amongst the members of the House of Assembly of each region. Since the only way to national politics was through the regions, there was little point in political parties extending their campaigns outside of their region. What was envisaged was that the political parties would confine their activities to within their own regions. This was the line taken by both Bello's NPC in the north and Awolowo's Action Group in the west. Azikiwe's NCNC, however, decided to contest both the Western House of Assembly and the Eastern House of Assembly. In the East, although many stood as independents, NCNC was the only political party. Having won the largest number of seats in the Eastern House, it simply invited successful independents to come under its political banner. The elections to the Western House or Western Region House of Assembly ended in controversy, with NCNC claiming that it had won the largest number of seats in that house also, and that Azikiwe was only cheated of the premiership of the Western region by Yoruba members of the NCNC, cross-carpeting to the Action Group. The cross-carpeting controversy. The door had been left open for Azikiwe's attempts on the Western region by the timetabling, which ensured that the election in the Western region took place ahead of the others. The plan was to exploit the two weakest links in Awolowo's Action Group's hold on the Western region, the two major cities, Lagos and Ibadan. In Lagos, Azikiwe and the NCNC had already inherited the political legacy of the dominant Lagos politician Abat Macaulay. In Ibadan, the key political figures were Adegoke Adelabu, supported by the then Alaafin of Oyo. They claimed that NCNC won the largest number of seats in the Western House of Assembly in these elections has been controversial. In Azikiwe's own account, written in 1970, when he had time for reflection, he stops well short of conviction and of the claims made on his behalf by some commentators. Towards the end of 1951, I stood for another election, this time to the Western House of Assembly as a representative of Lagos under the MacPherson Constitution. And I topped the poll. The NCNC was under the impression that it had won the Western House of Assembly election with 43 members out of 80. As it turned out, 20 of the legislators who were known or regarded as NCNC members or supporters or sympathizers decided to align themselves with another party. Not only did the NCNC not have a party manifesto in these elections, it also did not publish a list of members, as the parties were required to do. The party was including in its candidates who had successfully stood on other platforms or as independent, whom it calculated upon bringing into its fold. Azikiwe, as much as confirms this in its narrative when it proceeds to identify 16 out of 20 legislators who disappointed the hopes of the NCNC. However, none of the 16 is referred to by Azikiwe as an NCNC member. One is identified as the legal advisor of the NCNC at Sapele. He referred to another as having been a supporter and sympathizer of NCNC from time immemorial. The remaining 14 are listed as supported by the NCNC. Of the 16, only 7 were Yoruba. And so they claim that Azikiwe and his NCNC were robbed of victory in the Western region in 1951 due to cross-carpeting was false. Azikiwe, meanwhile, just so you know, Azikiwe is known in history as the most intelligent propagandist. Azikiwe was known to be a very, very pathological liar, and he adopted the lying traits as part of his own survival instinct, his poverty background and all that stuff, his desperation to survive and make it. Azikiwe, who later now turned into politics, he was like a pathological liar, like a lie more than he actually breathed. But he happened to be somebody who, at the time, he had his own followers too. And that is why he was like a weather. He was like shifting like a weather. He wasn't a straightforward man. He was a totally dishonest man. Nnamdi Azikiwe, just for the record. Okay? Well, let's continue. Here, he had newspaper. You understand? He had 2 newspapers that he was using to do his propaganda and all of that. And at some point, he used them as a means of protest. Here you get to protest something or push for something. But he was a very, very dishonest man. Nnamdi Azikiwe, just for the record. Right. The claim was simply part of the grand plan to stir up Igbo Yoruba antipathy. In the context of a multi-ethnic state whose citizens only enjoyed freedom of movement between each other's historic land, courtesy of the overarching British rule, under Azikiwe's leadership, who had positioned himself, British rule, and at that, only within living memory. The very idea that Igbo dominated NCNC under Azikiwe's leadership, who had positioned himself as the champion of his Igbo people, could, while ruling the Eastern region unchallenged, also rule the largely Yoruba Western region, was a case of an idea running way ahead of his time. You understand? He had that premonition that because he grew up in Lagos, definitely, the Yorubas, at that time, the Yorubas were for him. It's only that some people were using tribe to deny him the right to rule the Yorubas of the Western region. As provocative as that was, I would be mad. If I was living in the era of Azikiwe, I would be mad. You can now understand why they were able to successfully plant the hatred between the Igbos and the Yorubas due to the political machination of one man. And that became a generational thing. Yorubas are betrayers. Yorubas are liars. Igbos are liars. Igbos are this. All these things started in the 40s and the 50s because of the political machination of one man, Nnamdi Azikiwe. Let's move forward. Right? Azikiwe's failed attempt to dominate Western region politics was to backfire on him dramatically as the first sitting of the new House of Representatives on Tuesday, 29th January 1952, found him in the embarrassing position where he had no seat in the House. Not being a member of the Eastern House of Assembly, he was ineligible despite that House being under the full control of his NCNC party. At the same time, he had no support for his candidacy in the Western House of Assembly, whose leadership he had gambled upon winning. The Igbo leader found himself stuck in opposition in the Western region House of Assembly. In the Western region, where the action group was in power, Azikiwe was the leader of the opposition. In the Eastern region, where Azikiwe's party was in power, the leadership of the government was entrusted to Eyo Eta, his lieutenant. Thus, on the eve of a new era in Nigerian constitutionalism, Azikiwe, who had contributed so much to the national awakening in the country and who had made the strongest bid for national leadership, found himself without formal power in any regional government or in the federal government. Furthermore, some of his ablest lieutenants either were private members of the Eastern Legislature or were not members at all. Most of the members of that chamber had been elected as independent candidates, but had been invited by Azikiwe to join the NCNC. Some of them held ministerial appointments, while Azikiwe and his immediate lieutenants lacked formal power. Some of those who possessed it did not owe loyalty to the NCNC. Azikiwe's residence in another region further endangered party discipline, then in an embryonic stage or embryonic stage, embryo. Azikiwe was in a political wilderness from which one British intervention could rescue him, thus exposing his dependency. The only way he was going to get to the House of Representatives was through the Eastern Region House of Assembly. His maneuvering to find a way in led to the first major constitutional crisis in the country, which exposed the ethnic fault lines within the Eastern region. In his biography, Azikiwe glosses over the crisis. He wrote, "Before the end of 1952, a crisis loomed in the ranks of the NCNC as a result of the unwillingness of certain NCNC appointed federal and regional ministers to toe the party line. This is a long story which I hope to expand in a later volume. Consequently, I was drafted to contest an election into the Eastern House of Assembly and regularize this irregularity. The promise of more to come in a later volume was never delivered upon. To get back into the Eastern Region House of Assembly, Azikiwe needed that house to be dissolved. However, a drafting error in the 1951 Constitution meant that it was not possible to dissolve any regional House of Assembly without a dissolution of the Federal House of Representatives. Without an amendment of the Constitution by the British Parliament, Azikiwe was locked out of active involvement in central politics. The mistake of 1914 come to light. In the wake of the controversies thrown up by the 1951 regional elections, the competition between Awolowo's Action Group and Azikiwe's NCNC now reached a new intensity. In the new vote-chasing climate, the end of colonial rule was the guaranteed vote winner, on which neither of the lead protagonists was prepared to be outbid. In the subsequent electoral contest between NCNC and the Action Group in the Western region, including Lagos, politicians and their followers became irrevocably committed to, if not prisoners of, the mutual target date their electoral competition had established. Thereafter, it would have been political suicide for either party to slacken its drive towards that year of destiny. As Chief Anthony Enahoro stated, 1956 is a position from which it is impossible to retreat. On the 31st March, 1953, the Action Group's Chief Anthony Enahoro rose to move a motion that this House accept a primary political objective, the attainment of self-government for Nigeria in 1956. Anthony Enahoro, 1953 self-government motion. And listen, I am actually reading what Anthony Enahoro actually said. I'm talking about Anthony Enahoro's motion. So when I am reading this to you, I am reading the self-government motion moved by Anthony Enahoro in 1953, proposing that Nigeria should be given independence by 1956. So I'll take a tea break. So if you are joining us on YouTube or Facebook, remember that the first thing you should do is to share the broadcast as many times as you can. To invite other people that should possibly be listening too. And if you can do that, you will be you are highly appreciated anyway. So yeah. Anthony Enahoro, an Action Group member, in the face of the divided South, orchestrated by the Britain colonial office, or British colonial office, decided to say this as a means of putting forward the readiness of supposed Nigeria, readiness to be, for self-government. It shouldn't have. They shouldn't even have, I know. Well, let's go. Mr. President, sir, I rise to move the motion standing in my name that this House accept as a primary political objective the attainment of self-government for Nigeria in 1956. Sir, this motion is an invitation to the honorable members of this House to associate the highest legislature of our land with the expressed desire of the peoples of this country, whose views we all represent, for political autonomy in 1956. It seeks to provide representatives from all parts of the country with an opportunity to exchange views on the most burning questions of our time. It is an invitation to this House to make a declaration of objective with regard to Nigerian freedom. I do not propose, sir, to go into the argument for self-government because I am satisfied that it is generally accepted on all sides of the House that self-government for this country at some future date is a desirability. Therefore, I propose to deal with this motion in two main parts and very briefly. Namely, of what significance is such a declaration of objective? And secondly,